everybody. It's really an honor to be here keynoting in Zurich at this conference. I've heard so many good things, and I spent yesterday in a workshop with several of you. So I know the excitement here. And I think, it's really interesting. When I was speaking with Bjorn and Suzanne last week about my keynote, I couldn't help but think, how do I connect a topic that's so big, overcoming the challenges of building a 21st century business, to your day-to-day operations? Because we hear a lot about digital transformation in 21st century organizations, but these concepts can feel very abstract when compared to things like managing the intranet and the enterprise social network and internal platforms. But I want to challenge that notion, because I think that there's a way to link what you're doing day to day and the tools and the platforms that you're nurturing and the communication programs you're running to this overall objective of building a 21st century business. So if I'm successful with my keynote, what I will have done is both painted the picture for the broader organization, but then given you some very practical tips for how you can affect change within your own organization. So as Bjorn mentioned, ShiftBase is the research arm of PostShift, and what we do is we pull insights from the practitioner community and from executives who are sponsoring change to really get a sense not only of where the future is, but what that roadmap looks like. Both ShiftBase and PostShift came from a company called HeadShift that some of you may have known that began in 2012. So we really have, 2002. We really have a very long longitudinal view of how social platforms are affecting change and what the next frontier is when it comes to using these tools. In the past 4 years, we've been focusing in on client work at companies like Bosch and Daimler and Bombardier to really see how digital transformation is enabled by social platforms. And so I'm going to pull from some of that work and talk to you about what we're seeing and how we think that's going to drive change. So what we've seen over the past 15 years is that social technology is really an enabler. It can bring great benefits from a communication standpoint, from an internal collaboration standpoint, but we think that the real value comes when social tools are used to transform the organization and give us the means to rethink how we design the structures and the way that teams operate. This ultimately leads to a new future of work where we have things like network-centric leadership, which Ari's going to talk about later, the business model innovation, and new business structures. So the early use cases of social technology were really focused on the benefits of collaboration, knowledge sharing, communication. I know these are benefits and use cases that sit with you and you live them every day. Indeed, these benefits will become more broad and widespread as we see 70% of organizations adopt enterprise social networks. But it's really the principles embodied by social tech and its affordances of a much more radical way of structuring companies that make things exciting. And these enterprise social networks support new ways of working. Without them, we cannot create better organizations, structures, teams, and leadership models. They are the enabling platform. So getting into the research, for larger firms, many of them talk about the biggest barriers to becoming a 21st century organization. This is research. I went out and spoke to 25 chief digital officers and chief human resource officers to find out how they were driving change that came from digital transformation and focusing in on the people aspects, the culture aspect, the leadership, the structure. And one of the key things that we saw are these top capability gaps. It's really these legacy cultures and organizational structures that are holding back executives from driving the type of change that they see and creating the types of experiences and products that they know will push the business forward. And these executives that I spoke with saw this as a big problem because they perceived, rightly so, that the world is changing faster than our organizations can keep up. What you see here is a word cloud that comes from the first question that I asked them. I said, so what is driving change within your business and what's creating the challenge? And what you see here is you see a level of anxiety that's coming from many of these executives. They see empowered customers and consumers. They see the radical changes that are coming from digitization and new competitors that are disrupting digitally. They also talked about geopolitical events, the rise in oil prices, Brexit. This was before the American elections, so my country didn't factor into it, although I'm sure we'd be in here now. And they even talked about existential change like climate. This is well beyond what we think of as digital transformation, but the digital tools that we have give us a means to start to create an adaptive organization that can respond to any of these threats and opportunities as they come. And I say threats and opportunities because while in the interviews it was the kind of negative, it was the fear, the anxiety, and the threats that kept coming up, I also think that it's not doom and gloom, that even with uncertainty, technology introduces hope. And I think we have to keep that in mind in today's political and economic climate. We have to keep in mind how we can drive hope. So what I wanted to share with you is just a little story of how a connected product is creating hope in Amsterdam. This is called Tree Wi-Fi. And it was an entrepreneur's response to a real problem that's happening right now in Amsterdam. Last year, a European agency gave Amsterdam a D+ for its subpar policies when it comes to improving its air quality. And so what this entrepreneur who created this realized is that most people in Amsterdam are aware that this is a problem, but what they don't know is where it's a problem locally and what they could do to make changes in their own behavior. So in comes these small birdhouses. They have sensors and they are equipped to feel and to sense the air quality in a specific area. And what happens is that if the air quality improves to a certain point, the birdhouse turns green and everybody in that neighborhood gets free Wi-Fi. So it's a real incentive and an example of how this gamification, can enable us to do better things and to be better societies. So that's an example of a connected product, and I think it's one of my favorites because it is so hopeful and because I love birdhouses. But really connected products need connected organizations. And a few months ago, I was speaking to a colleague of mine in the industry by the name of Raj Rao. Raj was the vice president of digital transformation at 3M, and that's where I worked with him most closely, but he's now just taken the role as CEO of Ford's Smart Mobility unit. And he said to me something very interesting. He said, Christine, Uber has eliminated automobile branding. Now, what we think about when it comes to personal transportation is convenience and service, not about the car itself. And so his position was that Ford now needs to think of itself as a mobility company and not just a motor company. And then a few months later, I saw that he had taken this job, so I realized why he was telling me this. But I think it's a really important point, this kind of change in how companies think about themselves and the corresponding implications to structure and organization. And I say that because the implication to the organization is profound, particularly when you take into account this notion or this phenomenon called Conway's Law. So some of you may be familiar with Melvin Conway. He was a computer scientist in the late 60s, and he said that any organization that designs a system will inevitably produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization itself. We basically, if we have lateral hierarchical structures, we create lateral hierarchical products. If we have networked and flexible and adaptive structures, we can create connected products. So what we believe at ShiftBase is that this means that the era of bureaucratic top-down hierarchies is over, and that we need to move more towards a world of networked and lateral organizations, more agile organizations. And when we look around, we see some great new theories about these models of the organization. And they're actually not just theories. Companies are putting them into practice. So we see things like circle structures, which are used by companies like Zappos and often go by the name holacracy, if you've heard of that before. So the circle structure is an organizational design where you have multidisciplinary teams that are called circles that execute on a purpose, whether that be a customer need or a core set of functionality. At Zappos, each of the 1,600 employees will self-select into one of 500 circles or multiple circles based upon their individual skills and how they contribute to the overall purpose. And this is all done without formal line management in a 1,600-person organization. Now, Spotify is another org design pioneer. They use a tribe and guild model that was born of Agile. And here you have small teams that are organized around a customer need or around product features. And just like in the previous example, these are multidisciplinary teams. But what I think is really interesting about the Spotify example is that they have a second organizational structure. It's not the primary one, it's the secondary one, but that nurtures functional excellence. So you see here in the kind of guilds that are crossing over and in the chapters. What you see here are people who are not technically sitting on the same team and not working on the same problem, but share a common functional expertise. They can be coders, they can be web testers, finance people, marketers, and they are together in this kind of horizontal sub-team where they can share expertise. And it's that horizontal chapter that is responsible for some of the traditional line management activities like performance reviews and ongoing learning and development and salary setting. So what I like about this is that all the teams that I've managed historically have all been around the same function because you have a need to train people and to make sure that you're getting a certain level of quality, and you want to provide career paths for those people and all of the good things that a manager really wants. But I recognized in even the teams that I managed that we were not getting a diversity of input. So I really love the Spotify model because it shows how you can have those multidisciplinary teams but still enable functional excellence to keep improving. I know these organizational structures may seem lateral, particularly when I talk about no management and no managers. And that's because they are radical and they would be very difficult to introduce into large firms. In most large firms, any new model like this would hit a major barrier. Now, some of you completed a diagnostic test in advance of this summit. From that, I was able to collect the major barriers that this audience feels are in place that inhibit more innovative org structures in 21st century businesses. You said that the top four were dominant hierarchies, where the decision authority is not distributed across the organization. You said that there were limited data and insights, and this came up quite a bit in the workshop that we did yesterday as well. The inability for companies to make as a routine practice data and insights available to employees so that they can make decisions. And in fact, 1 and 2 are probably related. If you don't have the data and insights, or if you don't provide them to your employees, then how can you trust them to make decisions in the moment? How can you trust them to be accountable when they don't have the information? The third barrier was the lack of openness. Employees do not share their work regularly, do not share what is going into their decisions, and often this is due to a kind of fear of speaking up because of political reasons or because of power structures. And the final thing that we saw are that the leadership is still very command and control. So there's this notion of servant leadership that's been pioneered by companies like Hire and has been used even in very traditional organizations like the US Air Force. And that servant leadership has an expectation that the leaders are in place to remove the barriers of those who are servicing customers, and that is their primary goal as leaders. What I thought was interesting in the results that I got back was that this audience felt that there weren't enough of those types of leaders within the organization who devote those times to removing barriers. So by the way, if you're still interested, you can still take this diagnostic. It is available and it's complimentary. It gives you your scores and it will give you personalized recommendations. If you want to do that, it's at postshift.com/diagnostic. So you don't have to do that right now. I won't take you through it. Actually took the workshop through it yesterday, but I won't do that again to you guys. But yes, you get a complimentary report as a result. I will say this, hierarchy is not bad. It will always be in place as an indicator of status. I mean, we are human creatures, and hierarchy is necessary in understanding our social relationships, but it is a very poor means of organizing work. And worst of all is you see it when you see these never-ending email threads and chains when communication goes up and down the organization through the lines of power and doesn't go laterally across to communities of practice. We need to move beyond that. Hierarchy isn't going away, but we need a way to bypass the operations and the hierarchy in order to coordinate work. We need to change the default from teams and employees who are taking orders to actors, people who are free to connect and to create together. And I would say that you, as social intranet and collaboration owners, have the power to build a platform on which people and the organization can shine. And that's really what I want to talk about now. Here's how we think that you can overcome the biggest barriers to creating a 21st century business. I'll tell you to think in terms of software. And we won't go too deep into this, but just at a high level, software used to be, 20 years ago, very rigid. Many of you can remember interacting with these types of applications. The database and the code were vertically integrated and stovepiped. An app was typically optimized for a single purpose or a single use case, and these technologies were very brittle and difficult to change. We've now moved to an environment where software is a layer cake, where we have services and APIs and data. On top of that, we have experiences. And each layer can integrate with other tools and with other codes, so you have multiple applications that can tap the same resources. The services typically come first in an operating system, and then the applications get built on top of that. And I would say that this is actually a structure that you can take into the organization and think about how to build platforms within your organization that work in the same way. So we think that a modern organizational operating system has a shared platform of core capabilities and an architecture that allows customer-facing teams and individuals to plug in while remaining coordinated. This may sound very abstract at first, but we experience platforms every day. And I would say think of your phone, or think more specifically about the operating system on your phone. Your iOS or your Android operating system are providing the location and the security and the access services that your apps need to do their job. And so in the same way, we think that organizations will start to embed policies and rules and workflows into these internal platforms in order to better support client-facing teams and innovation. And the basic concept here is that back office functions like IT, HR, and procurement wrapper their capabilities as microservices, and that these are expressed through shared platforms that support the workflows and the customer journeys. Now, I will make this real to you because I realize if I keep talking about software architecture for too long, I'm going to lose you guys. We're working with a large manufacturer right now who wants to be able to spin up teams rather quickly in order to respond to unexpected threats and opportunities. And the real challenge that this manufacturer has in doing that is that they are several 100,000 people. They don't know what specialist skills exist throughout their entire organization across all of their locations. So what we did is we worked with them to create a skills directory on top of their enterprise social network. Team leaders can go in and they can see who has the specialist skills to support a project, and they can see general capacity levels for those people to know whether or not they're available. This is just one example of a microservice that you can make possible and that a customer team can use. These platforms enable new management methods. So a lot of middle management, and I lived through this for a decade as a middle manager. Most of it is around gathering information for reporting, communicating from the top, sharing policies and procedures. Harvard Business Review just did a report or just published an article that said that this excess management is costing the US $3 trillion per year, which is a really staggering number. Many of the activities and tasks of middle managers can be automated through these types of platforms. A lot of the policies and standards and governance are ripe for automation because they can be embedded and expressed through the platforms. Now, what are the implications of this? Do we think about a cull of middle managers through the organization? Do we think of these leaderless or managerless enterprises? Not necessarily, because I think for any of you who have ever managed people and spent a lot of time in systems and enforcing policies, you know that it takes a tremendous amount of time away from what you would like to be doing, which is leading and coaching and spending time on career development. So I would say that this type of automation doesn't need to spell the end of management and managers. Rather, it creates the space and time for true leadership. And I think a really good example here, who some of you may know, is Jos de Block. He's the CEO of Zorg. I do not speak Dutch, so apologies. But this is a Dutch home care organization. And what I really liked about him is that he takes the time on their enterprise social networks not just to use the networks and the platforms as a broadcast communication vehicle. He uses it as a way to gain ideas and share his thoughts from his entire organization. And I think you're going to see these types of leadership models emerge as managers have more time to manage and spend less time on the administrative bureaucracy. And I'm going to tell you that matters greatly because millennials demand this type of leadership. So in many countries, this is just stats from the US, but the UK, Turkey, there are very similar statistics out there that indicate that now millennials are the largest percentage of the workforce. And I've gone through and I've looked at a lot of the academic research on the psychology of the digital native generation and what they expect in employees and jobs. Many of them expect much more support and coaching from their managers. So you will need this time because the new workforce demands this type of leadership. So if we embody the rules and the processes and workflows and tools, then there needs to be less management control and rigid reporting lines, and that does pave the path for more self-organizing teams. And I mentioned a company, Favi, here. Favi is a French company that makes gearboxes for automobiles. At Favi, they have self-organizing teams that are focused on a customer. So they'd have a Volkswagen team or they'd have an Audi team. And I share this to demonstrate that this type of management theory is not just for startups. You see traditional companies in traditional industries who are making the changes if the environment and the platform is right. Okay, so now you've seen how platforms can transform an organization. I want to make one more point in the case for creating one, and that is that AI needs connected data and services platforms to work. There's been so much hype and so many companies that are looking at how they can take advantage of artificial intelligence. We see companies that are trying to buy AI startups whole hog and just move those into the business. Many companies are enamored with the idea today, but I will tell you it is not possible for AI to work if there is not a connected data layer that the algorithms can learn from and interpret and access over time. And I think we need to start thinking about how we work and how we coexist with machines, because we are entering an age of the machine revolution. The World Economic Forum just published some research to show, yes, there's a potential for job loss, 5 million jobs lost as a result of this, but 2 million jobs created. So what we need to do is we need to think about not just artificial intelligence, but we need to think about how robots, whether they be hardware or whether they be software bots, are used to augment our abilities and our intelligence. And this is already happening in manufacturing, in medicine, in law, across a diversity of professions. So, back to you and how you can bring these ideas to your day-to-day and affect change. How can we use our existing enterprise social networks and intranets to become more adaptive? I think the good news here is that ESNs are great social tools for enabling small digital transformation teams to broadcast and to manage change more broadly across the organization. And so here's just some basic ideas for managing that. The social platforms allow us to create a human sensor network for distributed change. These are platforms that allow us to give everyone a role and an ownership in creating the 21st century organization. And with leadership support, it allows people to be open about the current state of the organization. I say with leadership support because it takes emboldened leaders to give people the protected space to communicate those stories. And by mining the social data that's available on these platforms, we get a real-time view of the organization, the social relationships, the real org structure, the shadow org structure today, and we find out how the ways of working really get done within companies. And all this generates a kind of ambient awareness for our organizations. I would say, we had a big conversation about this yesterday with ESN metrics. Many of the metrics are focused on the wrong things right now. They're focused on number of users. They're focused on these kind of theoretical ROI cases that have been created. It doesn't matter how many people are using the enterprise social network if the value created is low. And we've seen this time and again with the enterprise social network that we've done with post-shift consulting. I would posit that there is no better use case for a social network than involving everyone in the organization in improving the company. So I would say at the heart of a distributed transformation program really are the metrics of what do we need to do to change our structure, our practice, our culture, and our leadership? How do we create them? How do we measure progress against them? How do we look at the shifts in attitudes and mindsets within our organization? If all teams and departments and divisions are asking these questions on a regular basis, and if they are empowered to try small experiments, then the organization is learning and adapting. And this is really the difference between distributed agile change management and the top-down change management that we've seen as part of business process reengineering and all of the kind of classic models, which, by the way, as we know from Kotter, usually fail. So I'll leave you with a metaphor on this before we get into more specific recommendations. We know that crash diets don't work when we're trying to lose weight. But there's the quantified self movement that has shown that people are more likely to make progress on their health goals through the biofeedback devices and through the data that they produce. So I would say, just as we have quantified self in our own lives to improve our own personal health, you could think about a quantified organization in which this model of gradual improvement and measuring data over time allows us to improve our organizational health so that we are more adaptive and more resilient organizations. And it's the internal social platforms that really give us the ability to ask people in real time whether or not the change that they're trying to affect is working or not. So I'd like to close with a couple of practical small steps for you owners of internal platforms. Hopefully this can start to show the roadmap between where we are today and the vision that I painted a bit earlier. I'd say first, gather and share stories of change. The stories are powerful. Stories are just, we're hardwired to appreciate stories. Our brains produce dopamine and all sorts of positive chemicals when we hear them. Religions, culture, corporate memory, it's all founded on stories. The social platform is a natural place to begin to gather those stories and to communicate stories of change. I would say to go further, to begin to create a change agent network or a change agent coalition with like-minded people across your organization. You can publish great content about new ways of working and examples that involve employees who want to do something, and all of these can be published on social platforms. Ask the organization, what new capabilities do you need to cope with so that you can anticipate change and enable the customer groups? And then what I would say, getting back to the stories, take those capabilities and express them as agile user stories. Now, these are a concept born of agile software development that really were about, in the beginning, making customer requirements more compelling and accessible to computer programmers. But I would say you can apply this type of practice to your business as well so that you capture goals for your organization. I've given you an example. This is an agile user story that one of our clients created, that same one that we were doing the agile staffing project with. They had this story: when planning capacity, I want to have greater flexibility to vary resource time allocations so that I can cope with unexpected projects. All the agile stories follow this pattern and structure. I, as a role, want to do something to achieve a benefit. And it's the discipline of having that structure and keeping it super simple that makes these stories both very difficult to write, surprisingly, but also powerful when you get them right and you share them across the organization. So once you have the stories, then you translate that into capabilities and change actions that define success for achieving the stories. And here again, you've got the change actions that you've identified, but you need a means to go back and measure whether teams are making progress against it. And what I would say again is that social platforms provide an effective means for that measurement because of the data that they produce. So by now, I have hopefully given you an idea of what a 21st century organization could look like in all of its flavors. I've shared with you how we believe platforms will enable customer-facing teams and innovation and the role that you can play in creating these platforms within your organization. I'd like to just leave you with a thought. Which is that we need to go beyond simple communication use cases for internal systems and make the case that they should become part of a platform for a new organizational operating system. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening. Would love to continue the conversation, so these are my contact details. We have SlideShare for the slides, so the URL to get them is postshift.com/i2summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.